Hello, everyone. My name is Olivia. I'm the program coordinator here at the Paulsdale Institute. And thank you all for joining us in person on the lawn for the screening of the Archivettes. And I'm really excited to be joined by Megan Rossman, who's the director of the film, who you all can see on the projector in front of us. Before we get started, I just want to start with our land acknowledgement. So the land upon which we gather is part of the traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape, called Lenapehoking. The Lenape people lived in harmony with one another upon this territory for thousands of years. During the colonial era and early federal period, many were moved west and north, but some also remain among the continuing historical tribal communities of the region: the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape Tribal Nation, the Ramapo Lenape Nation, and the Powhatan Lenape Nation, the Nanticoke of Millsboro, Delaware, and the Lenape of Cheswold, Delaware. We acknowledge the Lenni Lenape as the original people of this land and their continuing relationship with their territory. In our acknowledgement of the continued presence of Lenape people in their homeland, we affirm the aspiration of the great Lenape chief, Tamonend, that there will be harmony between the indigenous people of this land and the descendants of immigrants to this land, as long as the rivers and creeks flow and the sun, moon, and stars shine. So once again, I'm very excited to introduce Megan Rossman, who is the director of the Archivettes, which we are going to watch shortly. So Megan Rossman is an award-winning documentary filmmaker and assistant professor and chair of communications at Purchase College. Rossman's films have been screened at festivals including Doc NYC and Outfest. Her film, Love Letter Rescue Squad, won Best Student Documentary in the Emerging Filmmakers Showcase at the Cannes Film Festival American Pavilion in 2017. She has also worked as a multimedia journalist at the Washington Post and as the director of video at Teach for America. In 2011, she won a regional Emmy for her video Unfinished Business, Earth Day 40 Years Later. In 2019, Rossman collaborated on A Mother's Risk, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in International Reporting. So thank you for joining us, Megan.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
So I thought we could start, and you could just give us a brief overview of the film and what it's about.
Sure. So The Archivettes is about a group of women who realized that their history was disappearing in the 1970s, and they started a lesbian archive. So the film chronicles their now almost 50 years of activism and archival work.
Awesome. And Megan, could you tell us a little bit about what brought you to this topic?
Absolutely. So I actually used to live a couple blocks away from the Lesbian Herstory Archive, and I had a friend come visit me, and they saw on Google Maps and said, "What is the Lesbian Herstory Archives?" And I thought, I have no idea what that is, but I'm a lesbian, I should know what this is. And so I reached out to them, and Deb Adel, who you see in the film, and Maxine Wolf, who you'll also see in the film, got back to me, and they were like, "Oh yeah, we'd be happy to do an interview or, talk to you." And they were so generous and kind. And then when I showed up, I think I had never thought about my history beyond family history. And I consider myself like the rainbow sheep of my family. So it was such an affirming experience to walk into this archive and just realize that there were many people who came before me that were like me. And so basically once that, I was just hooked. And Maxine and Deb were so kind, as were a lot of the other, once I got everyone invested in the project, I made a short film, and the short film did well. And I realized, oh, well, other people are invested in this too. It's not just me. And so then I ended up making the feature.
Awesome. Thank you. So I wanted to ask, you kind of just hinted at this, but I also have experience. I volunteered at the William Way archives that are in Philadelphia. Cool. So it's archiving is kind of an important part for the LGBTQ community. I was wondering if you could kind of talk about, the archives as kind of a part of the community and what it means.
Oh yeah, I think honestly, any group of underrepresented people have a hole in history, and we're working to try to make sure that we're not disappeared, right? And I think you can apply that idea to many different types of archives. But in terms of the community, I think for the Lesbian Herstory Archives, it literally started in someone's apartment, and they just started by putting their own diaries in and just saying like, you know what, this matters to me. And then the community aspect started more because they started having like volunteer nights, and they realized that there was tremendous potential for like intergenerational connection, which I think for queer people, it can be very hard to find. You know, you often, perhaps you go to an event or a bar or a potluck or something, and you meet mostly people that are in your age group. And I think one thing that's really amazing about this archive and the community around it is that it is truly diverse, both in terms of people's backgrounds, but also in terms of age. And so like, you know, meeting these amazing women who are in their 70s and 80s, and, you know, up of that up to 100, and getting to know them was an incredible connection to community. And I think also has given me a lot of hope during, you know, a difficult time politically, where we see LGBTQ rights being taken away, that, well, if these people could survive for this long, like, you know, there is hope and things, we can keep going. And they reiterate that, I feel like, every time I talk to them.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a great point about hope, because I think that's something we all could use right now.
Definitely.
So the movie is about the archives, but I wanted to ask, how did the archive and what you found there influence the movie itself? Did you use material from the Lesbian Herstory Archive? And how did what you find change the narrative you were crafting?
Oh, that's such a good question. I could make 1,000 films on the Lesbian Herstory Archive, because there's just so much material in there. And I really encourage anyone, you know, to go visit. But if you do go visit, try to think about something that you're interested in and you want to start with. And so for me, the way that I kind of went about the process was, I started with, let me learn about the founders whose material is really deeply in these walls. And I worked backwards from there. And then I kind of realized like, okay, what are some like other things that are holes here that I want to learn more about? And the running joke at the archive is that the archive of the archive is like the most poorly kept part of the place, right? Because they're so busy like archiving everyone else's materials that it just fell through the wayside. So I went back through that, and that, like, you know, would take me in different directions. And then someone would tell me a story, and I'd like find something else in the archive and think like, oh, I have to include this. You'll see in the film, there's a story about Teddy, who's one of the Archivettes, her sister, and she has her jacket, her military jacket from Vietnam. And so when I saw that, I was like, wow, this is amazing. I really want to include this. And then there was a whole story behind it. It turned out that actually her sister was still afraid that the military was going to come after her, you know, even many years later. This is after she had retired. And she ended up, to agree to getting her sister to put it in the archive, she took her name tag off.
Wow.
And it was, I mean, it's still in there, and it's such an incredible piece. But there are just story after story after story on those types of things. I think another thing that kind of guided me in the process in terms of materials was the photo collection, because it was so deep. And what I would do is like, I would find someone in the collection, and then I would look up their file like somewhere else, and then a different group. And I was just like going through all this different stuff. And I could spend like so much time just sitting and looking at pictures. I used to be a photographer, so I just love it. And I think that was something else that had a big influence on me, of just thinking about like how images change and how the stories we tell and we attach to images changes as well. They used to have a slideshow, like, so they would make slides of things and they would go to different places, the Archivettes, and show the slideshow and say like, these are some things that we include in this archive, but you know, you really should come to see the rest.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask, I listened to another interview you gave, and you talked about using the home video collection that was in the archive. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about what you found there and how that got into the movie.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I almost forgot about the home video collection, which is kind of the backbone of the film, to be honest. Well, basically, I just decided I'm going to look through the archive for anything that has like LHA events or people from LHA. And we had a day where I pulled out these tapes and I was sitting there and had all the interns that were working that summer. And I was just like, I went out and I like bought a bunch of chips and stuff. And we were just like snacking, watching hours and hours of all this home video footage. And there were two things that stood out. One was that there was this incredible surprise party for someone. And in the videotape, the surprise is that everyone takes their tops off because this person like loved to be topless. And so it was just the most amazing home video to see. Ultimately, I felt like I talked to people and they were worried that like putting something like that out there in the movie could have an impact on them. So I decided not to. But I think it's like such an incredible and sweet moment in time. And then the other thing that happened is we were watching these videos and someone just popped up like eating Cool Ranch Doritos, and there we were eating Cool Ranch Doritos, and we're like, well, I guess not much has changed in 30 years here if we're still just like hanging out, munching on chips and like talking about pride marches that are to come.
So can you tell us a little bit about how you worked with the Archivettes themselves? What the process was like working with them on making this film, and if they had a story about the archives that was different than the one you thought you were going to tell.
Oh, well, first of all, I love your questions. These are so thoughtful and great. I think that anytime you have an event and you have multiple people, they all remember it a little bit differently, right? So I even think about like a holiday and my siblings, like we all have some different version of it. So like multiply that by like a lot more people and many more events. And here you are like trying to figure out, okay, what really happened? How did the move go? How did you raise money? All these things. And people just had all these different stories about stuff. And I think for me, one of the most important things was that I like fact checked and tried really hard to try to tell, not that anyone was making things up, but just generally like tried to tell the most honest version of what happened. And I think that that's kind of a power of collective history. It's cool because it's not just one person telling you and you vet it and you're like, okay, cool. You're like, well, there are a lot of different versions of this. And I ended up in the process showing the Archivettes a rough cut, and they had some notes for me, and it actually helped the film a lot. I was really nervous to do that in the process. At the beginning, in terms of working with them, I had made these short films and they had done well. And so they knew me and they had seen the work and they kind of like knew what I was after. And they have these coordinator meetings where they all get together, I think once a month, and they talk about it. So I pitched this idea and they talked about it. And I made it very clear, like, I want to tell your story, and I think, but I ultimately will have the editing choices, like the artistic choices to make the film and craft a narrative. And it seemed like everyone, understood that and was on board. Especially Deb Adel was sort of my main contact, and she's just like a wonderful, very organized, like very diligent person. And then a few other people were extra helpful with like different parts of things. So the opening scene of the film you'll see is a donation. And I don't think it gives away any spoilers because it's at the very beginning. But I had told another Archivette, Colette Montoya Sloan, that I really wanted to film a donation. And she was like, cool, people just like drop stuff off without warning. So this is probably going to be kind of hard. But someone had called that morning, and she called me and she was like, this is your moment. They are coming. And I dropped everything and like, got a friend to come help me with sound. And like, we went over there and just like waited for this person to come. And it turned out to be an incredible story. But I think a film like this, you really can't make unless you have support of the collective behind it. And they were really, really great. And also I think for them, it's, especially for some of the older Archivettes, it's a nice legacy that they have the story documented in this concise way. Another thing Deb had said to me is her family, like her whole life, she's been doing this, or, most of her life. And it finally clicked for all her family, like what she does when she showed them this film, because before that, yeah, they couldn't really get it. So I think That was sort of like a few notes about collaborating with them and, you know, how we were able to work together. I don't know if I fully answered your question.
No, thank you. That was great. So was there something that you wanted to put in the film that didn't make it?
There were so many things that I wanted to put in the film that didn't make it. And I think everyone that edits a film, you know, this, you have to like kill your babies. And I think that that was very true. And it was true in like a couple different ways. Like one way is just the archive is full of so many incredible people and their stories. And I couldn't tell everyone's story. So I'm actually working on another film right now that's a short film about Mabel Hampton, who is briefly mentioned in the film, you'll see, and her friendship with Joan Nestle. They have a really incredible story. And I kept like going in and trying to figure out like, well, how do I tell this story about them and their friendship and how like they, you know, crossed all these barriers. You know, Mabel Hampton was Black and came out in the 1920s. And Joan Nestle is like white and Jewish and 40 years younger than her. And Mabel worked for Joan's family when Joan was a child. And then Joan ended up taking care of Mabel at the end of her life. And Mabel was very much involved in the archive. So that was one story that I was like, oh, I have to, and I couldn't find a way to, so it's a separate project. And then I think I was just like very attached to some of the archival footage that, you know, didn't necessarily need to be in there because they did such a great job, like filming so much. And there were a couple people, Polly Thistlethwaite was like always interested in videography, I think, and had gotten like a home movie camera and just for a while was like filming everything all the time. And so I remember when I was getting feedback on the film, I was like, no, I want to include this, like, you know, this scene where they're like going to get bagels. And someone was like, this is very boring. You need to take this out. I'm like, no, it's interesting. And just, you know, kind of scenes like archival scenes that I think I was just very in love with the time and the material that they were there. And so it was kind of a combination of both like sort of condensing the stories and making sure that I was like clear about whose story I was telling, and then also cutting some of the material that like weren't essential to the story of the archive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. So if people take away one thing from watching this film, what would you want it to be?
It should be that your life is important and you matter. You know, please keep track of your history. You don't have to be a famous person to do this. And in fact, like I find the non-famous people much more interesting. And like that experience that I described of walking in and seeing myself, it was not because I saw myself in, you know, some famous lesbian. It's because I saw myself in these women that grew up in Ohio that were coming out. You know, I'm from Ohio, and they were coming out and describing their experience there. And so I think if you take away one thing, it's that like you matter. You should have a plan for where you want your materials to go. Even if you're young, I think it's never too early to start a donation and like get some movement. And two, you should think about how to keep track of your things. So now like we don't write love letters as much, right? We might text or we might write an email. But like keep that backed up, print it out. Like one of the archivettes, she was really involved in Black Lives Matter and she was printing every email and I loved it. Like every time I went in, there were these like huge stacks and she was like, someone's gonna want to know about this one day. And she's right, like people will. And you know, sometimes a paper backup is really the best way to make sure that happens. I also think print your photos, not just for archival for other people, but for you, like print them so that you have them and you have a physical copy. Because as a video editor, you know I've lost hard drives and I am very neurotic about backing things up and having them in different locations, but nothing compares to like that physicality that you get with printed material.
Yeah, that's a great point. The archival issues around everything being digital is like a whole nother conversation, but really an important point. So I wanted to open it up and see if anyone here had any questions for Megan. I think if you do, you might have to walk over closer to where I'm standing or sitting right now in order to be heard.
So Megan, you said we should make a plan. Like, where would you suggest people send their stuff? What kinds of things are out there other than LHA?
That is a great question. So, in terms of lesbian archives, there are a lot of different ones that exist. And there's one on the West Coast that's called the June Mazer Archive. There's, even one in Ohio that's like the Ohio Lesbian Archive. I think every major city has like a queer archive. But I would also say, like, think about where you went to college. Do they have an archive that you would want to donate some material to? What are your hobbies? What are you involved in? Is there an archive from a place that you've worked that you would like to leave some material with? One of the things that I learned from the Archivettes is that it's also really great. This is like second tier archiving, but to try to like spread your material around a little bit so that it's not just in one place, but maybe it's accessible in a couple different places.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great answer. I have one more question. So if someone wanted to learn more about this history after watching the film, do you have any resources you would suggest to them?
Yes. Well, first of all, I would say like go poke around the Lesbian Herstory Archive website because they just relaunched it and there's actually a lot more available online now. I think it's just lesbianherstoryarchives.org. If you just Google the Lesbian Herstory Archives, it will pop up. I think that's a great resource to start with. And then I would also just say, like, if you can try to pick an area, like even a geographic area that you want to learn about and like dig in. I know like New York, there are so many different queer archives. There are women's archives. There are, try to think about like what subset you're interested in and just look it up because a lot of people, the great thing, right, about digital stuff is that a lot more is accessible to a lot more people. You don't have to physically be there. Of course, the challenge is what we just talked about, but
Right.
this is a good example of when, it's great to have a lot of access to something.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just plug real quick while we're talking about it. There's the John H. Wilcox Archive in Philadelphia. That is a LGBTQ archive at the William Way Center. And then the Free Library of Philadelphia has the Barbara Giddings collection. So those are two kind of more local sources if you want to explore some more queer history.
Awesome.
So thank you so much for joining us, Megan. This was a great conversation.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thanks for your thoughtful questions.